Okay, for those of you who don't know me, my name is Catherine Murphy, and I'm the Science Coordinator for the Middle Rio Grande Endangered Species Collaborative Program. Today, we're very privileged to hear from Dr. Dave Van Horn. He's a Research Assistant Professor of Biology at the University of New Mexico, and his research and numerous publications have focused on the effects of anthropogenic and natural disturbance on nutrient cycling, primary production, and ecosystem processes in streams and rivers, as well as controls on the structure, function, and diversity of microbial communities. Dave and his collaborators have collected water quality data in the Middle Rio Grande since 2005, and today he's going to summarize the current understanding of water quality and ecosystem processes in the northern portion of the Middle Rio Grande and compare these findings with new data collected with funding by the New Mexico Interstate Stream Commission from the understudied southern portion of the river. Please feel free to type your questions as we move through the presentation in the chat, or raise your hand at the end of the seminar and we'll recognize you. So with that, I'll turn things over to Dave.
Okay. All right, is that working? Okay, great. Thanks to everybody. Thanks everybody for coming to the talk today. The title of my talk is Water Quality and Ecosystem Processing in the Middle Rio Grande, Integrating New Data from the Southern Reach for a Comprehensive Perspective. When I wrote the abstract for this talk, I was really thought I would use this talk to summarize everything we've learned about water quality in the Middle Rio Grande to date, and I realized that that was an overwhelming task for 45 minutes. So I've sort of tried to limit this to a couple of different topics. Even so, I think it's probably going to feel like a lot of data, and it's going to be kind of a surface level look at what we know about water quality data in the northern Middle Rio Grande, and then what we're learning about water quality in the southern reach. So please bear with me as I kind of take you on a whirlwind tour of what we've been up to for the last 17 years. So in the talk, I'll start off by kind of summarizing and going over what water quality data exists for the Middle Rio Grande and why that data is important for the conservation of species like the Rio Grande silvery minnow. Then I'll give you a bit of an introduction to the network that we've been building and servicing since 2005. And then the bulk of the talk will be comparing and contrasting the impacts of disturbances, stream metabolism, and habitat suitability at northern and southern sites in the Middle Rio Grande. So why do we care about water quality with respect to the Middle Rio Grande Endangered Species Collaborative Program? First of all, if you go into the long-term plan for science and adaptive management, water quality is called out numerous times as an important component of understanding what's going on for species of interest, as well as for managing these species and creating the best possible conditions for them. This is a lot of verbiage on this page. I think just going yourself to the science and adaptive management plan and looking through that can really make that link between why we care about water quality and the program here. But from a broader perspective, from the perspective of a stream ecologist, when I think about why we care about water quality for the conservation of species like the silvery minnow, I come up with three kind of broad categories. The first is water quality is really impacted by disturbances that occur within aquatic ecosystems that have the potential to impact survival and recruitment of species. Water quality can also be used to can be leveraged to model and make some estimates of gross primary production, which tells us something about algal resource availability, both in space and time. And this is important from the perspective of the minnow because we know the minnow feeds somewhat on algae or partially on an algal diet. And finally, water quality really provides sort of this basic level of habitat suitability, as well as drives some life history traits for species of interest. So these are sort of the three broad categories of why water quality, I think, is important for management. And I'm going to be organizing my talk around these three different broader topics. And I'll be using these icons as I move throughout the talk to orient you to the kind of water quality consideration I'm discussing. So next, I just wanted to briefly go through the data that we currently have available on water quality in the Middle Rio Grande. This list just includes water quality data. I did a pretty extensive Google Scholar search and pulled out all publications on water quality in the Middle Rio Grande. And I organized the publications by these three different sort of broader topic areas. And so these are the publications that really deal with disturbance and water quality in the Middle Rio Grande. And you can see there are a couple of different sort of subheadings under disturbance. There's disturbance related to wildfire, stormwater, flooding, and drought. But one thing you'll notice is I've sort of organized these with respect to the temporal and the spatial extent of the sampling that was used in the studies. And so I've labeled that these studies use continuous sampling, and I have underlined any studies that deal with water quality in the entire Middle Rio Grande. I've italicized any that just deal with the Northern Rio Grande. I'm sorry, there's no underline or italics for studies that just deal with the Northern Middle Rio Grande, and italics only for the Southern Middle Rio Grande. And what you'll see is almost all of what we know about disturbance in the Middle Rio Grande with respect to water quality has been conducted in the northern part of the river, with the exception of one paper that looked at the effect of drought on water quality in the southern reach. There are very few manuscripts and there's very little data available on whole stream metabolism in the Middle Rio Grande. Really just 2 chapters from Betsy Summers' dissertation. And both of those chapters were really focused on the northern part of the river. And from this perspective of sort of baseline water quality that impacts habitat suitability, there have been about 5 studies that use discrete sampling to look at water quality all along the Middle Rio Grande. But once again, those are discrete sampling studies. Those aren't continuous. We don't have continuous data. And then there are a couple of studies that use continuous data, but for short durations on the northern reach. And so when we sort of organize what we know about the Middle Rio Grande from this temporal and spatial perspective along these axes, we know a fair amount about all 3 of these sort of categories with respect to the northern reach of the river. And we know that based on continuous sampling. We know a little bit about water quality along the entire Middle Rio Grande, thanks to grab sampling along the entire reach. But what we don't have is good continuous data along the entire reach of the river. And that is really necessary if you're going to build sort of comprehensive models about how water quality might be impacting the species and populations throughout the entire river. This is really important because basically we have a very heavy focus on research on the northern Middle Rio Grande, limited information about the entire river, and the problem here is obviously the largest populations of minnows are down south, and that's the place where we know very little about water quality. This became really evident to us, I don't know, 3 or 4 years ago. We realized that we had really missed sampling that part of the river. And when we were looking for some additional funding, we talked to ISC. We were in the middle of a funding gap, and ISC generously funded some of our sites in the northern Middle Rio Grande, but also provided funding to extend our work down to the south. And I'm going to be trying to combine today what we know about the northern part of the river with this new data from the southern part of the river. Keep in mind, the data that we've collected in the northern part of the river is extensive, and we've have spent a lot of time analyzing it. I think I would say that we have a pretty mature understanding of what's happening in the northern part. The southern part that I'll be presenting today, we're just starting to look at. So yeah, keep that in mind. A little bit about the history of the water quality program. It started in 2006. This was back when I was a second-year PhD student. And I started to, under the guidance of Cliff Dom, I started to install some continuous water quality monitoring locations in the Albuquerque reach with the goal of assessing temporal and spatial water quality trends in the Middle Rio Grande. In 2012, we added 3 additional sites above Cochiti Reservoir, and then 2 sites were added on the Sevietta and at Escondida in 2021. And just recently, let's see, 5 months ago, we added sites at Highway 346, which is just south of Berlin, and one at Santa Acacia. So we're really starting to have nice coverage of water quality sampling all along the river. This map shows you where all of our current sites are located. These are sites where we're currently collecting data today. And at each one of these sites, we have a YSI EXO instrument continuously collecting a variety of parameters. I'm going to really quickly show you what our sites look like. And this is moving from north to south. So starting at Bernalillo 550, we have our instrument here, which is attached to a catwalk piling from on a MAFGA's catwalk. Down at Bridge Boulevard, we have another casing. This actually has been reinstalled, so it's no longer leaning. It's reinstalled in a much more robust manner. This is our installation at I-25. We just got permission to bolt it to the bridge, so hopefully it's sustaining and persisting through these super high flows we're having right now. This is our new installation down above Highway 346. This is one of 2 different installations we have on the Sevietta National Wildlife Preserve. One is for the higher flow conditions and one's for lower flow conditions. This is the site where we've installed down at Santa Acacia. And finally, this is our Escondida site. This is under the bridge at Escondida, if you're familiar with that area. So one of the things I wanted folks to take away from this talk is just simply what data is available. And so what I'm showing you here, and the reason I want you to know that is because all of this is publicly shareable. So if you reach out to me and ask for data, we'll send you data. So what I'm showing you here is data from a single site. This is the Bernalillo 550 site. This is data that we begun collecting in 2007, and it goes through the present. And what you're looking at are temperature, dissolved oxygen, pH, turbidity, and conductivity data. And you're seeing about 2.5 million data points here, about 175,000 data points per year. And you'll notice that there are a couple of gaps in the data. Those occur during funding gaps. But this is what's available. So if anybody has use for this data, if they want to include it in their projects, reach out and we can get it to you. And then you can also go back in the talk later and look at all of the sites and all of the time frames that we've been collecting data for and at over the last 17 years using this slide. Okay, so before I dive into the data, I wanted to talk just real quickly about what it's like to collect continuous water quality data in the southern Middle Rio Grande. When we first proposed this project, I thought, we've done a ton of data collection up north. How different can it be? We'll just go down south and install our sites the way we normally do, and we'll start collecting good data. So in July of 2021, we finally got permission to do installs, and I went down and did this first install. So I drove this angle iron into the stream bank. I bolted another piece of angle iron to this boulder. I put this casing in, and I put it in a place that I had been to the previous summer, and I knew that there was good flow. And I went ahead and deployed an instrument in this casing. And then I watched the hydrograph, and about a week later, a big storm event came through. And so I thought I better go down and check out the site. And so I want you to sort of pay attention to this area of the photos I'm about to show. This is what I came back to a week later. About 2 meters of sediment had accumulated upstream of the instrument that I had just installed. The instrument was completely buried, and I was collecting absolutely no data. And I spent the first summer really fighting with the conditions in the south. We thought the northern Middle Rio Grande was challenging to work in. The southern Middle Rio Grande is infinitely harder. And I think it's really just due to the tributary inputs like the Puerco and the Salado, which are just dumping and moving enormous quantities of sediment through this system. So throughout that first summer, we fought with this quite a bit. I think we have pretty stable locations now, but I probably shouldn't have just said that. Okay, so now I'm going to go ahead and jump into the actual data. And I'm going to start off by talking about disturbances and how they impact water quality in the Middle Rio Grande. The first research question is, how do storms impact water quality in the northern Middle Rio Grande? And for each one of these data questions, I'm going to provide you with a map of all of our sites, and I've circled in red the sites that I'm using data from to answer this question. And then I've got this arrow pointing to basically the entire data set that's available from that site. And I've highlighted in red the data that I'm using to answer this question. So for this research question, we use data from the top 3 sites. And we use just one summer's worth of data. This was the summer of 2018. This is work that Peter Rieger, who was a postdoc with Ricardo Gonzalez-Pinzon at the time and was also working with me. He's currently working for Pacific Northwest National Labs, but he's working remotely, and he's in Albuquerque, and he's working at, or he's an adjunct professor at UNM now in the biology department as well. So this is work that he did during his postdoc. And Peter had a couple of goals with this work. The first was to figure out whether or not he could identify where in a watershed a particular storm event was coming from that was impacting water quality. And then the second goal was to figure out what were the differential impacts when storms were moving off of different parts of the watershed. And so what Peter first discovered is that urban and non-urban storm events have very distinct signals. And if you look at the top right-hand part of this figure up here, you'll see 4 different figures for one urban storm event that occurred on June 3rd, 2018. And what Peter did was he graphed up specific conductance data, that's on the y-axis, versus time for 4 sites: Cochiti, Bernalillo 550, Alameda, and Rio Bravo. And the goal was to figure out, where do different storm events start showing up, and what is the signal when they do start showing? And so here you can see from these top 2 sites, there was no change in specific conductance, which means the storm event wasn't in the river at that point. And then in between these 2 sites, a storm event occurred. And we can see that because there was this sag in specific conductance, and that sag continued down to Rio Bravo. That is, turns out, the signature of a storm event where precipitation has fallen on an urban environment. Peter also figured out that there was a contrasting pattern for storm events that fall on non-urban parts of the watershed. So from this storm, and actually I can't, hold on. For this storm, which happened on July 25th, there was no change in specific conductance right below Cochiti because the storm came in between these 2 sites, or entered the river in between these 2 sites. And then at Bernalillo 550, he sees this large increase in conductance, and that increase in conductance followed or propagated all the way downstream. What Peter next did was he graphed up all the data points. He used non-dimensional NMDS, non-metric multidimensional scaling plots to graph up every data point from all of these different storms. He color-coded them by urban and non-urban. So urbans in green, non-urbans in green, urbans in purple. And what you can see is you get pretty perfect separation, or nearly perfect separation, of urban from non-urban storm events. So this was really the first time any of us had systematically looked at how stormwater events are impacting water quality in this part of the river. And so the next question was, is there a difference in how urban events impact storm water quality versus non-urban events? And let me take a step back for a second. I forgot to mention the reason that there's a sag in conductivity for the non-urban events, for the urban events, is because if you imagine water falling on an urban landscape, the water hits a bunch of non-pervious surfaces, so impervious surfaces like concrete, pavement. It doesn't have a lot of time to interact with soils, and so it doesn't pick up a lot of solutes. And so it runs into the drainage network without many solutes in it and enters the water and dilutes the conductivity or the salt that's already in the river. The opposite is true for water that's falling on non-urban parts of the watershed. That precipitation interacts with the soil, picks up solutes, and enters the river carrying more solutes than we find at background. So the next piece then is, how do these stormwater events impact water quality? And I'm just going to focus on one part of this table because it's a very busy table. And I'm going to focus on the change in dissolved oxygen, so delta DO. And what you can see is for these urban events that enter the river, the change in DO can be quite dramatic. For 9 out of 10 of the events, DO decreased, and it decreased up to almost 6 milligrams per liter, which drives dissolved oxygen levels down to down below the no acute lethal concentration, which has been established for the Middle Rio Grande silvery minnow. So some pretty significant potential impacts to water quality of these stormwater events. The non-urban events during 2018 also caused DO sags, but those weren't nearly as deep or as severe as those coming off the urban events. Interestingly, as I was preparing for this talk, I went through our 2021 data very carefully. And during that year at Bernalillo 550, there were 3 non-urban stormwater events that occurred that drove dissolved oxygen levels down to 1.5 milligrams per liter at that site. And so it appears that some of these non-urban stormwater events really do negatively impact water quality, but it depends on the year. And we're not really sure where those came from. We haven't looked into that in detail yet. Okay, so that's kind of a really quick, brief summary about what we know about how stormwater impacts water quality in the northern part of the river. But open questions are, do those impacts propagate downstream? And how do southern tributaries impact water quality at the sites, further downstream that are really relevant for silvery minnow conservation? So what I'm going to show you next is data from 2022 from 4 different sites, from Bernalillo 550, Bridge Boulevard, Sevieta, and Escondida. So these sites really span our northern reach of the Middle Rio Grande all the way down to Escondida, which is as far south as we have instruments now. And what I did for this talk was I wanted to look at whether or not storm impacts from the northern Middle Rio Grande propagate to the southern Middle Rio Grande. And so what I did was I went through every single storm event that occurred at the Bernalillo 550 site or the Bridge Boulevard site. And I looked for evidence that it had propagated down to the Sevieta or to Escondida. And so I'm going to show you some plots that look like this. I'm sorry, these are a bit busy, but we've got data from Bernalillo 550 here, Bridge, Sevieta, and Escondida. For each one of those sites, I've graphed up dissolved oxygen in the blue line. I've graphed specific conductance in the maroon. And I've highlighted storm events with these red boxes. And what you can see is during this I think it's a 7-day period in the middle of July in 2022, 3 storm events occurred and showed up at the Bernalillo 550 site. And we can see that from these spikes in specific conductance. So these would have been coming off non-urban parts of a watershed. And they were easy to follow down to the Bridge site. They propagated very nicely, however many kilometers that is down to Bridge. I should know that. But then when I looked down at the Sevieta sites and the Escondida sites, there was very little evidence of further propagation down to the southern Middle Rio Grande. I think this is probably true for several reasons. One is there's just a lot of water withdrawal occurring during that time of year. And it's also a long ways down there. And so these spikes and these impacts are really going to attenuate as they move downstream. But what we did see at the Sevieta and Escondida were 2 very distinct and separate storm events impacting conductivity and minimally DO that we did not see up north. And so what this is telling us, I think, and we're going to explore this in much greater detail, is The disturbance regimes with respect to stormwater inputs are quite different and quite separate from the northern part of the Middle Rio Grande to the southern part. During the monsoon season, we're just not seeing propagation. But what we are seeing is inputs from some of the tributaries down south. And so when I look for an explanation about what might be causing this really significant increase in conductance, the slight decrease in DO, the Rio Puerco was an obvious place to look. And sure enough, the Puerco had run during that exact period and was probably delivering really high salt loads. And so it looks like both urban and non-urban, storm events are important in the northern part of the Middle Rio Grande from a water quality perspective. But in the south, it looks like those southern tributaries are really driving those disturbance impacts down south. Here's another example. This is 7 days of data toward the end of July. In 2022, once again, dissolved oxygen data in blue, conductivity data in maroon, storms highlighted in red. And when we look up at the 550 site and the bridge site, there were something like three storm events that came through during this period. They propagated really cleanly between sites. But then when we look at the Sevieta and Escondida during this time, there are actually 5 storm events that are occurring, none of which seem to be directly related to what was going on up north. And so once again, big inputs from the Puerco, and it looks like a real dominance of impacts from southern tributaries as opposed to impacts propagating down from the north. So just to wrap up this little whirlwind tour about how disturbance impacts water quality in the northern and southern Middle Rio Grande. First, urban and non-urban storm events have distinct and potentially large impacts on water quality with, implications for species of interest. The northern and southern reaches of the river appear to have varying disturbance regimes with respect to storm impacts, likely driven by local tributary inputs. And finally, dissolved oxygen, I didn't cover this very clearly, but dissolved oxygen appears to be differentially impacted at northern and southern sites with pretty significant impacts up north, but we haven't really seen much of that down south yet. One final caveat here is we just installed or reinstalled our site at I-25 and installed a site at 346. And so we should be able to do a much better job of tracking the movement of some of those storms that originate up north to the southern part of the river. And that 346 site, I think, is going to be really key because it's upstream of the inputs from the Puerco and the Salado. And so I think one of the things that's happening here is when we get a storm input from the north, it often gets masked by what's happening in one of those other tributaries. And that site should really let us know whether or not storm inputs are making their way into the southern part of the Middle Rio Grande. Okay, next I'm going to talk to you a little bit about how we've been leveraging our water quality data to understand something about primary production and algal resources that are available for organisms in the river. I wish I had my notes for this slide. What we do here, and I think the reason I wish I had my notes is because my students do most of this work at this point. What we do here is we take our instantaneous water quality data, particularly our dissolved oxygen data. And so we're taking 15-minute data, and we're using a stream metabolizer metabolism model package in R to ingest the dissolved oxygen data, as well as temperature, specific conductance, photosynthetically active radiation, and barometric pressure. And from that, we can really look at what's driving changes in the daily dissolved oxygen profile. And we can back calculate how changes are being driven by gross primary production, so photosynthesis, which is going to generate oxygen. We can look at ecosystem respiration, so that's both heterotrophic as well as autotrophic respiration. And we can look at how physical controls are influencing our dissolved oxygen profiles, and that's what K stands for. So from this data, what we get is information about how much gross primary production is occurring in the reach above one of our instruments. And it's really an ecosystem integrative measure. And the value that we get is in grams of oxygen per meter squared per day for the production piece and for the consumption. So the question that we're going to use this approach to answer first is, how does GPP vary spatially in the northern Middle Rio Grande? And as well as temporally. And this is work that Betsy Summers conducted for her dissertation. So she's the person who really got us started looking at and applying these models to the Middle Rio Grande to really start to dive into ways in which gross primary production are shifting and changing through time and space, and what's impacting those shifts and changes. So I'm presenting her data. I think it'd be a great idea to bring her back at some point to really dive into all the work she's doing. She's about to submit one of these manuscripts and has a second one that's hopefully will be submitted by the end of the summer as well. So to answer this question, Betsy took data from above Cochiti at Bernalillo 550 and at Bridge Boulevard. She used data from 2 years, 2014 and 2015. She put all of the data into the model, which sounds easy. It's not. It takes a lot of expertise. It's pretty time-consuming work. But what she was able to generate here was time series data. And so you're seeing the metabolism data in green, that's GPP, and red, that's ER, and discharge data in black for 3 different sites, Cochiti, Bernalillo, and Rio Bravo, for these 2 different years. And it's pretty hard to look at the time series data and get much out of it. So Betsy generated monthly mean data. And what this tells us, or what this allows us to look at, is both how much primary production is occurring at these 3 different sites, and when is it really peaking seasonally. So we're just going to focus on this middle set of figures. We've also got Q and ER data, but this is the GPP data, which I think is of particular interest when we're thinking about the minnow. And what you can see here is that gross primary production at our northern Cochiti site increases throughout the winter and early spring, peaks in the early summer, and then declines as you move back into fall and winter. This is probably associated with an increase in light availability, which decreases as summer monsoon storms increase turbidity and basically limit the primary producers in the benthic compartment. So that's what happened at the Cochiti site. And one of the nice things about these 3 sites is they're geomorphically very different. Cochiti's a little bit narrow. It has a silt sand substrate and a slightly deeper channel. Bernalillo also has a slightly narrowish channel, but it has gravel and cobble as the substrate. And then Rio Bravo has a very fine sediment substrate and is quite wide. And so this gives us sort of this nice geomorphic gradient to look at how geomorphology is impacting algal resource production throughout the northern part of the river. So at the Bernalillo site, what she saw was sort of differential GPP patterns between 2014 and 2015. In 2014, multiple peaks occurred throughout the summer and the fall. In 2015, GPP peaked in the fall. And at the downstreammost site at Rio Bravo, GPP peaked in the fall as well. This is probably during a period of relatively stable flow. So it's after spring snowmelt, after the monsoon season. So it's stable flow, but also low turbidity, but still relatively high light availability. So when we're thinking about when algal resources are the most abundant for consumers, this really helps us start to get an understanding of where and when that's the case. What we've tried to do over the last month is extend our understanding of GPP and primary production resource availability down to the southern portions of the Middle Rio Grande. And to do that, we ingested a year's worth of data. And when I say we, I mean Betsy Summers and Eric Joseph, who's a new graduate student in civil engineering. And so Eric took data from October 2021 through September 2022 for all 4 of these sites, ingested it into the model, and calculated metabolism values, GPP values, for all 4 of these sites. And the first data I'm showing you here is just the box and whisker plots of those GPP values. And the first obvious trend is we see a decline in productivity as we move downstream, although we see a slight increase in between the Sevieta and Escondida sites. Next, if we look at the time series data, we can once again see that the Bernalillo site in blue here has by far the highest GPP. But if we're interested in when these peaks are occurring, it looks like GPP is really peaking at 3 sites, Bernalillo, Sevieta, and Escondida, during the late spring, early summer, so May, June. However, as with what Betsy showed in 2014 and 2015 at our bridge site, we're seeing peaking in the fall, in October. So I think this lets us know, first of all, where GPP is the highest along this gradient. And secondly, it lets us know when GPP is spiking or is peaking. And next, we're really going to be trying to understand what are the drivers here. Betsy's other manuscript has really identified flow and turbidity as drivers depending on the time of year. But once again, I think it'd be good to get her back to talk about that at some point in detail. So to summarize this section of the talk, let's see, overall GPP declines in the downstream direction in the Middle Rio Grande. Seasonally, GPP peaks most commonly in late spring and early summer when PAR is elevated and Q is low, but before the monsoon storms increase turbidity. And at some sites, GPP peaks during fall when flows and turbidity are low, but PAR is still relatively high. Okay, the last bit of data that I'm going to show you is our first attempt at really understanding how water quality might be impacting habitat suitability from sort of a basic water quality parameter perspective. So the research question here is, how do basic water quality parameters impact habitability in the Middle Rio Grande from north to south? And once again, I'll be using data from Bernalillo 550, Bridge, Sevieta, and Escondida. And the data that I'm showing you here are, this data is the max daily temperature data for each one of these 4 sites from June through September, only for days where we have overlapping data between all 4 sites, so that we can really compare apples to apples when we're doing this cross-site comparison. And what we find here, I think, is really interesting. So we've got temperature on the x-axis, and we've got the frequency of those temperatures on the y-axis. So this is a kernel density plot. And so if you look at data from 2021, we've got this dashed line graphed up, and this is the no acute lethal temperature limit for the Rio Grande Silvery Minnow. And so anything below that line suggests pretty good habitat suitability. Anything above that line suggests there might be some real issues with respect to mortality for the species. And the thing that's of real interest here is when you think about the Middle Rio Grande, you might expect water temperature to just simply increase as you move south. The water has had more time in contact with the air, elevation decreases, air temperatures increase, and that is not what we're seeing here. We're seeing that the lowest temperatures occur at 550, our northernmost site. Our next lowest temperatures occur at our Sevieta site, and that's the really counterintuitive part. These are not, this is quite far south. And then the Escondida site is actually a little bit cooler than our Bridge site. And so our second northernmost site, Bridge, is actually the warmest, or has the greatest number of exceedances of the no acute lethal limit for temperature. And in 2021, that site exceeded the no acute lethal limit consistently during those 4 months of the year. In 2022, the exact same pattern was present, but the temperatures were cooler. And so once again, Bridge was the warmest, 550 was the coolest, but we didn't have nearly as many exceedances. And that could have something to do with the data overlap issue. This is dissolved oxygen data. And once again, what we're doing here is we've got DO on and this is the minimum daily DO value for these 4 sites from June through September. And we've got that minimum DO value on the x-axis. We've got the number or the prevalence of that value on the y-axis, so kernel density plots. And we've got the no acute lethal concentration line here. And so everything to the right of that is going to have plenty of DO from the perspective of a silvery minnow. Anything to the left of that, you might be getting into trouble. And we see, once again, something sort of interesting, which is, unsurprisingly, our 550 site has the most DO because it's the coldest. But then those 3 southern sites, they all cluster together really tightly. And we don't have that many exceedances. The site with the most exceedances actually is our further south site at Escondida. And that is true both in 2021 and 2022. So to briefly summarize this section of the talk, the northern Middle Rio Grande site consistently has the highest water quality with respect to temperature and DO. Max daily temperature values at the Bridge and Escondida sites often exceed the non-acute lethal limit for the Rio Grande silvery minnow. And DO values rarely drop below the non-acute lethal concentration value at any site. And Bridge, Sevier, and Escondida have really similar min-daily DO profiles. Let's see. In conclusion, water quality in the Middle Rio Grande is highly dynamic, both spatially and temporally. There appears to be a real disconnect between the northern and southern Middle Rio Grande with respect to storm-related disturbance regimes, but that's a very preliminary finding, and we're really going to try to explore that this coming summer. Algal productivity declines from the north to the south in the Middle Rio Grande, and it's highest at most sites during early summer months. However, some sites experience a peak during fall. And finally, while temperature and dissolved oxygen vary between sites, southern sites don't necessarily have degraded quality as compared to more northern sites. There are some of these sites like the Sevieta that appear to actually be sort of thermal refugia, even though they're located pretty far south along the river. With that, I guess I will take questions.
All right, thank you so much, Dave. You did really well without your notes. So, okay, so regarding the first portion of your talk, Ari Posner with Reclamation had a question. How do you define a storm event?
Good question. Let's take a look. I'm laughing because it's a bit tricky. So storm events, basically, we're looking for increases in discharge. But one of the really interesting things about the Middle Rio Grande is you can have a very small increase in discharge that really impacts water quality. And that's because for some of these intermittent stream systems, if you get a big monsoon cell sitting on top of one of these systems, one of these small subwatersheds, it can generate enough flow in that subbasin to make some contribution with respect to flow to the river, but it might not actually increase flow very much, maybe 50 CFS. But if it's in a subbasin that's highly erosive or that has a lot of salt content in the soils, that tiny increase in flow can have a massively disproportionate increase in conductance, turbidity, and I think dissolved oxygen. So that's a great question. I mean, we're really trying to look for these excursions in water quality from baseline that are usually associated with flow, but it isn't necessarily a really large change in discharge, which I think is a little bit counterintuitive. It was for me, at least, coming from an Eastern perspective. I grew up in the East Coast, so coming from an Eastern perspective, that was very counterintuitive to me. Ari, was it Ari?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, Ari, does that answer your question?
Yeah, for sure. I know how difficult it is. It's a question that hydrologists grapple with a lot, actually. And but with respect to the runoff, I think the other thing, and this is related, is this idea of kind of the first flush that happens in the watershed. And so depending on if you call some of those second pulses a new storm, then you may get a different result than calling it all the same storm.
Yeah, all right. I think that's a really good point. It's something that we're currently trying to explore in some of the other watersheds that we work in, the Canadian watershed in particular. We see some really different water quality impacts from first flush events as opposed to everything else that happens during the rest of the year. And I think the same probably applies to the Middle Rio Grande too, but we just haven't sort of dug into our data in that detail yet.
Yeah, the other thing I would say is the duration between the storms.
Yes. Because
the other thing that happens is within those ephemeral tributaries, you can get a lot of deposition between storms, just aeolian and things like that. And then you can have these kind of big flush events if you had a long time between storms. So yeah, but really interesting work, and thanks for sharing it, David.
Yeah, absolutely. You're absolutely right, though. Antecedent conditions are huge in the magnitude and actually, I think, in the direction of how some of these storm events impact water quality. And we've done a little bit of that work. We looked at dissolved organic matter coming off the urban area in a manuscript from a couple of years ago, and antecedent conditions really played a big role there. And I think they probably play a big role in some of our other work. It's something we'd love to dig into. It's just a matter of time.
Cool, thanks.
Yeah.
All right, thanks for that question. Next is Casey Ish with MRGCD. Typed in a question, not sure exactly where the temperature data for Sevietta is being collected, but cooler temperatures at Sevietta could be the result of irrigation return flows from the San Francisco outfall and San Juan outfall that return water back to the river at the Rio Puerco confluence. Maybe some elevated groundwater interaction as well.
Yeah, that's a really good point. We haven't tried to track this down yet, but I think you're absolutely right. So the Sevietta site is located, I guess it's sort of hard to verbally describe. Can you folks can still see my screen?
Yes, we can.
So this is the Puerco input right here. So I believe the San Francisco and La Jolla drains come in over here. Am I getting that right? And then the Salado is right here. So the Salado comes in below. We're kind of in between the Puerco and the Salado. So I think you're absolutely right that we are getting those lower temp values due to agricultural return drain inputs. But I think it's interesting that maybe a fact that other folks were aware of and I just wasn't, but I think this reach really is serving as this sort of temperature refugia. We've also seen that below the Santa Acacia diversion dam, pretty cool water below the dam, probably both because water coming in is cool, but also because there's water moving, shallow alluvial aquifer water moving in from both sides of the river at that point. But then as we move down toward Escondido, water temperatures really increase. So thanks for that comment. Appreciate that.
All right. Were there any other questions for Dave? Oh, Grace says there is probably due to groundwater upwelling for sure in that area.
Oh,
Also,
didn't-
I wanted to add, ask Dave on the bridge site. Since you only really have 550 down the bridge, does that kind of make sense as far as like the increase in temperature in the Albuquerque Reach? Are you getting a certain increase in temperature per mile, or is it
Yeah.
is there a smooth gradient, or is it sort of an issue with something in that bridge area that's causing that?
Grace, that's a great question. We need to explore that a little more fully. We honestly created that figure 2 days ago. So I haven't had a whole lot of time to explore, but we have data for about 12 years, I think, where we have sites at Bernalillo 550, Alameda, Rio Bravo / Bridge, and I-25. And so we should be able to go back to those data sets and look closely during the summer months to figure out whether or not it is a sort of just linear increase or whether or not there's something specific about that site.
Or that area. Okay, thank you. That would be interesting.
I want to make sure that I forgot to go to my acknowledgements page here, which is embarrassing. This work has been supported by a massive number of folks. First of all, the Southern work that we've talked about today is all funded by the ISC. The Army Corps of Engineers is now providing some funding, or starting to provide some funding for that as well. But up until this point, all of that data was collected thanks to funding from the ISC. There's just too many folks to name here, but this is not data that is just a result of me doing work. This is data that's resulted from just a massive collaboration between lots of different folks from a whole ton of different agencies. So I apologize for not thanking everybody sooner.
That's great, Dave. Okay, so if there are no more questions, I wanted to let you know, Dave, that I wrote down that we need to reach out to Betsy Summers and ask her to present her work. I wanted to mention, given your laundry list of folks that have helped you and worked with these data, that we're also having our science symposium this December, and we would love for you and your students to come and present their work in more detail during that symposium. So we'll be sending out some announcements about that, but we'll definitely reach out to Betsy before then.
Great.
Also, I wanted to ask you, you did mention in the earlier part of your presentation that these water quality data are available upon request. And so I was wondering if you could let folks know how to request them if they want them.
Sure, I'll type my email address in the chat here. We're working on getting a permanent site for this. We've housed this data at a variety of different sites, but yeah, finding something that's really consistent has been challenging. So,
all right, thanks for putting your email in there. And did you want to address Mick Porter's question? I don't know if you saw it.
Lethal temperature is not an appropriate ecological metric. Critical temperature methodology is more similar generally. Mick, if you have references for me there, I'd love to see them. If you could send them my way, I'll definitely update the way we're talking about this, both in manuscripts as well as in presentations. I just don't know of any manuscripts, any published data that addresses those issues directly for the silvery minnow. So yeah, we're aware that Buell's data is probably not the best. Well, it's good data, but it's maybe not the most appropriate way to be looking at acute limits, but it's kind of what we have. So if I'm missing something, please message me and let me know.
Thanks. Mick, did you have a follow-up for that? Maybe not. Okay. Were there any other questions for Dave while we still have him? Okay, I guess you're off the hook, Dave. Thank you so much for presenting all this information.
Absolutely. Thanks to everybody for coming. Appreciate it.
All right, thanks, everybody.
Thank you, Dave.
Thank you.